Coming up on Garden Talk.
If someone had a pretty good base mix and had used some synthetic nutrients in it a time or two, they could probably still turn that into a living soil environment over a short period of time. The microbes will remediate quickly. They'll remediate just about anything quickly. Anything really from the ocean is going to be salty and possibly contaminated. We also like planting stuff like carrots and radishes and things that are going to penetrate the soil and feed everything in the soil or below the soil. The quality is absolutely higher. The more research you do up front and the more prepared you are going into that situation, the better your turnout's going to be for sure.
What's up, everybody? If you that don't know me, my name is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, and you're tuned into the Garden Talk podcast. This is episode number 55. In this episode, I interview James from Red Dirt Raised. He's been gardening for his entire life, and he currently runs a commercial facility in Oklahoma. In this episode, he talks about several different things, such as transitioning from synthetic to organic, ferments, water-soluble mineral inputs, and more. Thanks to all of you who support this podcast through Patreon. If you'd like to support, you can do so by going to patreon.com/MrGrowIt. Before we get into it, I want to acknowledge that one of my goals for this podcast is to bring zero cost for information about gardening, all plants, to the general public. That being said, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's episode who helped make that goal possible. Thanks to AC Infinity for sponsoring this podcast. They sent me over their grow tent, which has a canvas density of 2000D, making them the thickest grow tent on the market today. It has an aluminum plate that mounts your controller to the grow tent with a lightproof pass-through for cable routing. The frame has 50% thicker steel poles and carries 2 times more weight than the standard grow tents. Coupon code MrGrowIt will get you a discount on their products, and I'll leave a link to their website down in the description section below. Dutch Pro is a sponsor of the podcast. Coupon code MrGrowIt10DP will get you a discount on their products. They are a plant fertilizer company that has been around for over 30 years. They originated in Amsterdam, and their nutrients are available in several countries across the world. They have everything needed for proper plant nutrition, from base nutrients to additives and pH regulators. I will leave a link to Dutch Pro's Amazon store down in the description section below. And don't forget to use coupon code MrGrowIt10DP for a discount on their products. And we are back. Welcome to the Garden Talk podcast. Today I am joined with James from Red Dirt Raised. How you doing today?
Good. How are you, Chris?
Doing pretty good. Thanks for asking. Excited to talk to you today. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of things that I think are going to be valuable to the audience listening in. We're going to talk about transitioning from synthetics to organics. We're also going to get into things such as ferments, water-soluble mineral inputs, cover crops, and so much more. But first, before we get into those things, what we like to do is an introduction. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into gardening?
You bet. My name's James. I'm the owner of Red Dirt Raised. And we have a small family-ran medicinal farm, medicinal plant farm in Oklahoma. We started it in 2019 and have been gardening all my life. Other types of plants, vegetables, house plants, but have been commercially farming in Oklahoma since 2019.
That's awesome. And I know I believe you started out with synthetics, right? And then you kind of transitioned over to organics. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. First, kind of before talking about the transition and how to go about it, general question here, which I know the answer, but I think it's important for the audience to know the answer as well, which is why make the change from synthetic to organic?
For us, it was all about quality initially. If you've tasted the difference in an organically grown tomato as to compared to what you may go buy at the grocery store, you'll know immediately. The flavor is quite a bit stronger in that organically grown tomato. Same thing goes for medicinal plants. The quality is absolutely higher. You're going to see a more diverse terpene profile, higher cannabinoid content altogether. And then, for us, a lot of it had to do with sustainability, being able to provide your plants with the food they need, instead of using a bottle, using something from the earth, or maybe even, a ferment or something that you have made there yourself. But no, it was a number of reasons for us. If you're running a farm commercially, the bottom line is always going to help steer decisions, and overhead on any size farm isn't small. So that was another really attractive selling point for me, trying to choose what direction we were going to go. But it all started with quality. If you've had organically grown medicinal plants, you know the difference.
One major thing you mentioned is sustainability, right? Now, certainly there are pros and cons to growing both ways, I believe. Sustainability really stands out there. Going out and spending money on nutrients every single round can be expensive, and you can certainly save money going the organic side of things. I think that's a reason why folks transition to the organic side of things, because you can save a significant amount of money if you do things right, transitioning over to organics. So I'm glad you mentioned that one. Most of my audience are home growers, right? So they're in containers, they maybe buy a bag soiled, and they're starting to use synthetic nutrients. Oftentimes what they're doing is throwing out that medium, right? They're throwing out after they finish their grow. They're usually throwing out that soil and then buying a new bag of soil starting fresh. The reason why is because things such as salt buildup can occur, which can, once you plant your next crop, you're at higher risk of running into issues. Also, there can be a nutrient imbalance over time that can happen within the medium. Now, you're out on a farm, right? So there's no throwing away the soil and starting fresh, right? You have to you've already used synthetics. You have to use that same soil in order to transition to organics. So what are the steps to kind of go about transitioning from synthetic to organic?
So depending on scale, there's a few factors there that are gonna, I think, really line out the steps for people. For a tent grower, somebody at home with a small garden, you could just simply, education is key, first of all. Try to educate yourself as much as you can. For us, it was huge making that decision because it's a totally different system, and if you screw it up, it can be costly. So we went with raised beds, and if somebody were growing in pots and using bottled nutrients, they could go to something that fits their tent, which I think a 4x4, you got a 4x4 or 3x3 bed, and then the same goes for 4x8 or anything bigger. But I after lots and lots of research, we decided to use basically the same base mix that everyone else uses, which is 33% compost, 33% peat or cocoa or your desired media, and then 33% aeration, or a third of each, or however you want to say that. But at home or commercially it's going to be quite a bit more complicated. But in a tent at home, someone could either find a local soil yard that's already mixing something real similar to that and amend it themselves, or you could go with a great company like Build-A-Soil and buy something that products that already have integrity and are already mixed. We mixed everything at home and went and bought peat from Lowe's, which was Canadian sphagnum peat moss. We like rice hulls and pumice for aeration, but you can use other types of aeration, volcanic rock, and people use perlite. We've actually got some soil that has perlite in it, but and you can source your own compost. That one's tricky, as you probably know. That's really where you're probably either going to be make it or break it. I would say is finding good compost. So we did that at home, and are even doing some composting here at home. And we're trying to do a biocomplete compost, which is what I would suggest for anybody. That's really more like your Soil Food Web and Elaine Ingham School of Thought. But amending your soil is going to be a little different. If you're commercial, I don't suggest using certain products. Kelp meal, anything really from the ocean is going to be salty and possibly contaminated with things in the medicinal plant market that are going to cause health risks and issues like that. Heavy metals, but there's also some easier ways to dial things in. And for us, since we were commercial, we tested our soil. We were really doing that under the guidance of Brandon Russ and doing it consistently, once a month at least. If you've got rows and you're using raised beds, that gets a little bit tricky because each individual bed is going to be a little bit different. And if you're growing different cultivars, that's going to change things up a little bit as well. Different plants pull different things from the soil. So, but really, there's some great information out there already. Coots Mix and that recipe's already out there for people to easily access. I think you can even get a lot of Build-A-Soul's recipes and what they're using just off their back. But we prefer soybean meal, alfalfa meal, and try to avoid things from the ocean, not just because of heavy metals and other contaminants, but because of sodium and salt buildup. So once they get that mixed, if they're not going to test their soil, I would inoculate, plant, and take off because it's going to do pretty awesome. And it's going to do a lot of the work for you, and it's going to get better with time. We like using cover crop and other things like that to help with the full cycle there that's happening in the soil food web, things breaking down. We do use worms, worm castings even. But once you get the worms in the bed, you really don't need the castings a whole lot anymore. They're doing a lot of that for you. I could keep going. You want me to?
I did have a follow-up question. I should have asked this during the intro, but on your farm, what's the size? You said you were in raised beds. How many, what size raised beds are you using? How many plants are you growing? Things like that.
So we have 3 flower rooms indoor. We have a veg and mother and propagation area. And then we have a greenhouse that we just built. You can find a lot of that on Instagram at Red Dirt Raised. Okay. We've just gotten that finished, and really 2022 is going to be where we're getting to display the spaceship we built out there, because it's honestly better than our indoor operation, and more sustainable, more regenerative. We're going to be using the sun We'll also be doing some no-till out there. I think eventually we've taken and had a lot of people bless us with advice and information over the last few years, like Brandon. But we'll also be doing some ferments and do ferments indoors, just in not in high amounts. We really try to let the soil food web do as much of the work as we can, and then Brandon is mainly a water soluble guy, and a lot of his information and recommendations have been with water soluble. So that's a really easy way to get balance in your soil. And after testing, on a commercial level where you're trying to keep production consistent, that was a big deal for us. We having that in your toolbox is huge.
We'll get deeper into water soluble mineral inputs in a little bit here. So you're in beds, and you kind of started with your own soil mix versus trying to revive the native soil in the ground. Now, my question for you before we move on is, can home growers reuse the soil where synthetic nutrients have been used in, or do you think they should just start fresh with making their own soil, like you mentioned, with the 33-32-33 mix?
I would definitely say start fresh with that 33-33-33. That's not to say it can't be done, but that's not the way we did it. And I would assume that if someone had a pretty good base mix and had used some synthetic nutrients in it a time or two, they could probably still turn that into a living soil environment over a short period of time. The microbes will remediate quickly. They'll remediate just about anything quickly, or revive. Allowing them to do most of the work has really been key, I think, for especially no-till farmers, but for us as well. Trying less is more kind of attitude. Really allowing the plant and the soil to have that symbiotic relationship and stay out of their way as much as possible.
That makes sense. So for the 33-33-33 mix, I just released an episode recently with Jeremy Silver from Build a Soil. Not sure if you caught that one or not, but he gets real into detail about 33-33-33 and what to use when you're soil building. So we won't get too deep into that in this episode, but I do want to know what initial amendments you're putting within that mix.
So initially we'll start with really good compost, which is going to have more nutrients in it than just about anything else you're going to put in there. Already broken down and ready to go, available. But we'll also add alfalfa meal. We might use a little bit of green sand. We might use a little soybean meal. We do have some oyster shell meal in our soil, but not a lot. We use some gypsum, calcium sulfate. There's a little calphos in our soil. Worm castings, which are going to be a great source of nitrogen. And then we fired it up about 3 weeks after actually getting soil in beds with worms, a little bit of cover crop, and really kind of let everything go for 20-21 days on its own before planting.
Okay, and then eventually those nutrients, majority of them will deplete, and then you have to re-amend. Like a lot of folks, when growing indoors, they'll have that initial amendment, and then they'll do a top dressing, roughly 30 days into the grow. Typically, folks will do it before flipping the flower. They will do it 20 to 30 days into flower. So that's just the general way of going about feeding, we're talking indoors. After you do those initial amendments that you mentioned, that initial planting, you said you wait 20 days and you plant in. At what point do you do any other fertilizer, add in any more, top dressing or what?
I think midway through flower is a pretty good point. If you've tested your soil and you know the balance and the nutrition levels are there, then you may be able to do a run with water only. And, that's kind of the goal. But we like malted barley. We use regular water and only do that a couple of times a week in those beds. But occasionally there will be a feeding. There will be a little bit extra in there. And some people will just top dress. If we can, we like to water in as much food as we can, as much nutrition as we can, as much inoculation as we can. The water really helps spread things out,
Absolutely. Now, circling back to the water-soluble mineral inputs, what water-soluble mineral inputs do you use?
So we're pretty big on soybean amino acids, soybean hydrolysate. You get a high quality version of that, and it's pretty water soluble. They make a form of calcium sulfate, gypsum, that is really fine and powdery and is fairly water soluble. A lot of people are familiar with Epsom salt, magnesium sulfate. We use it, and extremely water soluble. Potassium sulfate. You got to watch what you buy because there are chemical versions of these, and then there are mined mineral versions of these. And I suggest like down to earth products that have been mined and aren't some byproduct of industry. But for the most part, that is it. We do use humic acid in powder form, and we also use a humic fulvic full power, but that's really, I'd say, the majority of the water solubles that we use.
So you mentioned a ton there. When do you generally apply those water soluble mineral inputs? I'm sure there's different times for different ones, right?
Sure. Cool thing about those is you can top dress them and literally get like a full run, 7-8 weeks before you really start seeing levels depleting. Or you can do small feedings with them and water them in, once a week. The soybean amino, the humic acid is something that you can use almost all the way through, and I mean vegetative stage on into flowering. You could cut back on the soybean aminos because of the high nitrogen content. I would say probably week 5, week 4 of flower, especially if you're running a system like ours where you have other sources of nitrogen in the soil already. But the others, calcium sulfate, gypsum, obviously all plants like calcium, some more than others. Medicinal plants are hogs, and they're gonna want strong source of calcium and magnesium all the way through growth, really, vegetative and flower. But potassium sulfate, you're going to use that quite a bit more in the later stages. I would say in lighter amounts in your first 3-4 weeks of flower. And then that's going to get a little stronger in probably weeks 4 through 8, 4 through 10.
I know there's some that you mentioned that people often use as foliar feeds. They want that fast acting. Perfect example would be if you're starting to see magnesium deficiency, they'll do a foliar of Epsom salt. magnesium sulfate. Do you do any foliars at all for those water-soluble mineral inputs?
We do. We like to use the magnesium sulfate. We like to use a bioavailable version of silica. We also foliar feed some OHN, and a lot of our IPM is foliar. Not to get off track there, I know we can get into that later, but let's see if I'm leaving anything out. Even microbial foliars, we have a couple of different products. One made right here in Oklahoma called Wind River, and it's great in soil and as a foliar. See if I'm leaving anything out. I think that's really about it. A few stimulants. There's a couple different foliars that we use that will stimulate the plant's immune system, if you will. And I think that's about it for foliars.
How often do you inoculate microbes?
Once a week, at least, we're doing something. We've got a couple of different inoculations that we like to use. Some are more, most, I'll be honest, are more fungally dominant. But we do have a couple of different products even that we like. We've used, everything under the sun, fish shit, mammoth pee. But honestly, there's nothing like really good compost. And, you can do, a lot of people don't like to do teas indoor, especially because of the risk you may take brewing bad bacteria. So, a top dress of compost, especially if you're using a good mulch layer, will go a long way. You can water that in, or you can do a concentrate. You're basically straining the compost into the water and creating a concentrated version there, and then using that to water in instead of brewing. And I'm drawing a blank. Your Soul Food Web folks are probably bigger. Your Elaine Ingham folks are probably bigger on these terminologies and know them well. But that may be a little safer version, and we often do that. But we also do teas, and we use some species of fungi as food cycling, nutrient cycling, and they're a benefit to the plant's health. And then some are going to be more for IPM and, to keep pest pressure down, other bacteria, fungi, and pests.
I'm glad you brought up the risk of brewing a tea, which is that you're brewing like anaerobic bacteria, right? Which that's happened to me before. Not having enough air stones in the bucket and then giving it to my plant, and all of a sudden the plant looks like crap for like several days, and it's like, eventually it bounced back, but it was a significant step back.
Sure.
So it can absolutely happen. Making sure you have enough air stones in there is important. Some people actually put a air line going directly into their bag of compost that they put into the bucket. I don't know if you do that as well or anything like that, if you've heard about that tip, but I thought that was pretty interesting.
We haven't tried that. So we have a brewer that we built with the help of Leighton Morrison. Not sure if you're familiar with him from Future Cannabis Project. They do Living Soil Conversations. But Leighton helped us build a brewer here that we've loved. It's a 55-gallon Tapco tank, cone bottom, and then it's plumbed and has a really cool air pump going to it that's super quiet and low maintenance. But with that air entering the bottom instead of using a stone, it eliminates the need to clean a stone or, buy new ones. You gotta replace those things after a while just from gunk. But now we've loved that brewer, and we'll use it even just to mix a feeding, just to aerate our water, not necessarily to brew a tea, but just to have good aerated living water and moving water. But yeah, we that eliminated a lot of the bad issues with brewing for us, and then a few different things about brewing, or tips that we've been given are strain your compost instead of brew it. That can often be very helpful, and you can make that concentrated version of that inoculant that way, and then water that in. But if you're seeing any brown around the ring or the top of your brew, and you are brewing a tea, the stuff that starts sticking to the side of your bucket or your tank, that's usually, I believe, kind of a bad sign of that bad bacteria brewing, that anaerobic bacteria brewing. Or maybe I was told that it was waste of some sort from, the microbes. But anyways, we tried to limit the times. When we started out, it was sometimes 24, 48 hours of brewing. And then that eventually got to where it wasn't really any more than about 12. And by that time, we're watering it in. And usually don't see any of that brown film stuck to the side at that point. So I think that avoids a lot of that anaerobic activity, people run into. You do like a 48-hour brew and you got a stinky, smelly, and that doesn't always happen. I think if you have enough sugar or carbohydrates in there for those microbes to feast on, and they don't die off, and they probably thrive for, not real sure how long, but...
Yeah, I typically do no longer than 24 hours. Sometimes I'll pull a little bit earlier than that, just to kind of safe side things. But I don't really do teas that often. I mean, like you mentioned in the beginning, you can just top dress compost and water that in, right? That's very effective as well. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Let's flip it up. Let's talk about ferments. I want to get into this. This is something that I haven't done myself, but I hear more and more people talking about it. So can you talk to us about ferments? What are they? How you go about doing them?
You bet. So we're in no way are we experts in ferments, but Van from K&F Garden, I met him at a convention here in Oklahoma in 2020, I believe, and ended up using some of his techniques. We started off with kind of his baseline in veg, which was humic and aminos, which is a great combination, by the way. I'm not saying that's all plants need, but we've seen good results from it. The ferments that we used were his versions of K&F, and I think he's doing things a little differently, kind of a hybrid version, if you will. For him, he lived in LA, I believe, and didn't really have a farm to do K&F on, Korean natural farming, and I think simplifying it was probably what he was going for. But anyways, fermentation, taking fruit and vegetables with sugar and allowing, or without, I think a lot of people actually do it without, and allow that stuff to break down. And, same process used for making alcohol. But all those nutrients become available again, and at some point you can stabilize it. With his recipe, we were only going a couple of weeks and using lots of different kinds of fruits and veggies. and you try to be responsible, go get organically grown fruits and vegetables and start there if you're going to do it that way. But I think the whole premise behind Korean natural farming is probably using the land you have, to grow those fruits and vegetables, and then fermenting them, and using that to feed, so plants feeding plants, and you're kind of speeding up that process with fermentation. Van's idea behind a lot of it is even, I think, trying to push certain cannabinoids and terpene levels, and using certain fruits and vegetables to target those. So we started using this bloom ferment, and have now for, I would say 5-6 months with success. That's in a living soil system and raised beds, and it's not only using ferments. So we're definitely a lot of the times using less than the suggested amount. And sometimes if we feel like they really need something, we may give them more. But combining that with that soil food web, I've seen nothing but amazing results from. And, I know there's a lot of controversy there. But I mean, all in all, it's we're still doing the same thing, and we have the same goal. So for us, it's always been about quality, not necessarily. There's almost belief systems built behind these methods, and if you veer one from another, the community doesn't necessarily always agree on stuff like that. So, but for us, it's always been about providing the best possible medicine we can. And so if that's combining some of these methods together, that's fine with us.
Do you have like a general recipe that somebody can follow, or like a source that a noob like me can go to and learn how to start fermenting?
You bet. Go follow at KNF Garden. Go follow, Jeremy has some great ferment products that I've seen available. So that's another good source. Don't come to us for that information necessarily. I can give you, the recipe that we used, but we're not KNF gurus by any means. The man himself, Chris Trump, I believe at Chris Trump on Instagram. Lots of good ferment farmers out there. Lots of good guys still in Cali, Humboldt region using ferments. Man, I wish I could name them all off on the spot. But that right there ought to get you started. And Van's method is so super simple. You can't go wrong there. I think he's even selling his bloom ferment. So you can go buy that and just start there and see, the difference. But, he claims you're going to see a greasier, terpier flower, and we have seen some great results from our experience with that. So I think you can't go wrong with his stuff. Jay Plant Speaker, I think, is another guy that may do some. Hell, I think Masonic does some KNF stuff. Lots of good teachers out there.
Yeah, lots of sources there. I'm familiar with some of those names, but not all of them. So I'll definitely be following some of those names for sure. I do want to get into cover crops a little bit. So we're talking about making that transition from synthetic to organic. Cover crops is something that's optional, but a lot of people use it because there are benefits to it, right? So for example, I use clover for a cover crop. White Dutch clover is the kind that I use. And one thing I've learned is that it helps with nitrogen fixation. So it's actually taking nitrogen from the air, converting it, and putting it to the soil in a form that the plant can uptake. Right. So that's just one benefit on one particular type of cover crop. There's a whole different types of cover crops out there with various amounts of various types of benefits for sure. What do you use for cover crops, and kind of what's your process for planting them as well?
We're big on clover as well, and native grasses are great. You just got to be careful what seed you're starting with, because you never know how that was grown or harvested. So build the soil. Here in Oklahoma, we've got Redbud Soil Company, and they make some great cover crop blends. We also like planting stuff like carrots and radishes and things that are going to penetrate the soil and feed everything in the soil or below the soil. But process for planting cover crop for us, we started with cover crop after initially filling our beds and everything. And then we'll replant cover crop after harvest when we've got access to the soil again. And really, that's about it. That really takes care of itself really well. You're letting nature do its thing, and not too complicated there.
So between grows, when you're planting that cover crop, how long are you letting that cover crop grow? And, are you cutting it down and letting it die off? Is there like a period of time, like 2 weeks or a month, or what's your time period?
So we'll plant and basically let the cover crop grow until it's maybe becoming annoying, getting a little bit out of hand. We may chop it back then. But a lot of the times we'll let that naturally occur as well, and haven't had to do a ton of maintenance. Now, we don't use near as much cover crop as a lot of people I've seen. Cantwell over Green Life Productions has usually got a pretty nice green bed going, it looks like, and we don't use quite that much. I think he uses dichondra and some other things that we haven't tried yet, but are very interested in. But yeah, I would say, experiment with stuff like carrots and radishes, and growing even, companion plants with your medicinal plants or your vegetable garden. You'd be amazed the difference in a bed full of plants and a pot with one, and what you see going on there. They definitely enjoy one another.
I think so too. I've seen it for sure.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of people trying to make that transition from synthetic to organic, right? Taking a step back, generally speaking, what advice do you have for those trying to make that transition?
I would say be patient. Everything may not play out just like you want, especially that first run or two. If you're doing a no-till type of method, that less is better mindset will go a long way. And don't water so much. That's probably one of the most common mistakes that people make going from synthetics to organics. If you're using a decent sized pot, which I've heard Jeremy and others talk quite a bit about, there's going to be enough moisture and nutrition in that pot to last that plant beyond, what we normally would think. And, just be patient and spend as much time reading and searching for information as you can. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So, in an organic system where things are a little bit more permanent, The more research you do up front and the more prepared you are going into that situation, the better your turnout's going to be for sure.
Well said. So wrapping things up, how can the listeners find you, and what do you have upcoming in the future?
So the listeners can find me and my family ran farm at Red Dirt Raised OK on Instagram, and our website will be up soon, reddirtraisedok.com. If you come to Oklahoma, or if you're in Oklahoma, you can find the dispensaries and shops that we're in on our Instagram account or website. And yeah, that's really, that would be the place. Email would be reddirtraisedllc.com. I think that's about it.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely have a link to at least your Instagram down in the description section below. I know YouTube's they don't really like the medicinal plants being linked down below, so I'll see what I can do as far as links to your stuff. If you enjoyed this episode, click that thumbs up button. I want to get as many thumbs up as possible. That helps on YouTube in particular in order to reach more viewers. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, or press the follow button if you're on a podcast platform, and share this episode if you think others would obtain value from it. James, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. Definitely some great information. I learned a thing or two, and I think this is valuable information to my audience as well. So thanks for coming on, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Chris. You too.